The middle class is about to go extinct. Yes, we are the dinosaurs of the 21st century. I'm talking about me and you. We, the laptop class. The educated, salaried professionals who the sociologists Barbara and John Ehrenreich, way back in 1977, called the professional managerial class, or the PMC. Remember this short form PMC? We will keep returning to this throughout this video. So till now, we believed that we, the PMC, are completely indispensable. But now that feeling is changing very fast, because we all know some middle class family that is struggling to maintain their old lifestyles. Perhaps it is we ourselves who are in that position right now. Everywhere, in every country, the middle class is no longer aspiring to spend more or to earn more. It is just aspiring to survive. Some have called this the great white-collar recession of 2025 and predicted that this will only get worse. Well, maybe that is not the right word. For the middle class, this is not just a recession, it is a complete replacement. Capitalism doesn't need us anymore. It has found a much cheaper and soon what will be a more efficient alternative, artificial intelligence. And there is a second big reason why we are getting wiped out. It is inequality. The very inequality which helped us prosper for nearly 4 decades has now become our enemy. If you find this claim outlandish, watch till the end, because I am going to prove to you how the middle class's own past affluence is now its biggest enemy. But to understand the story, we have to stop using the vague term middle class and begin by explaining who this middle class really is. Strangely, what historians call the middle class is actually the ruling rich of today. The entrepreneurs, owners of companies, the capitalist class. Yes, the traders and merchants of the mid-18th century who were affluent and influential were originally called the middle class because they were seen to be in the middle of the two fundamental classes in much of Europe at that time. The aristocratic feudal lords on one side and the peasants who were often tied to the land on the other. In the middle were the merchants and traders who were becoming increasingly rich and also influential as European powers began to back expeditions to find new markets and colonies across the world. Out of these arose the great industrialists of the 19th century, who gradually captured power across Europe and became the ruling class as capitalism spread across the world. For much of the 19th century, the factory owner ran their businesses directly, maybe along with a partner and with members of their immediate family, often the sons. But as factories became larger and industrial processes became more complex, many more workers had to be overseen. That is when the entrepreneur needed to hire white-collar workers, those who would assign tasks to the workers on the factory floor, manage and supervise them, and also keep them under surveillance. Even though they too were employees working for a wage, their task was to extract as much work as possible from the blue-collar or frontline workers. They were firmly on the side of the owners of capital at a time when workers were organizing across Europe to fight for their rightful share. The latter half of the 19th century was full of revolts of the working class, the most famous of which, as you know, was the Paris Commune of 1871, when the working poor of Paris seized control of the city and then were brutally crushed. The white-collar workers didn't let any of that blood stain their clean white shirts. They firmly identified with their employers and were loyal to them, and for this, they were paid handsomely. These were the first members of what we know today as the middle class, professionals and managers. On one side were the industrial capitalists, on the other the factory workers, and the white-collar manager was right in the middle. White-collar work expanded beyond private offices and factories to other spaces, like banks for instance, which became the backbone of capitalism, taking deposits from the average household saver and lending it to capitalists who then set it to work to produce more goods and services. Yet, as late as the beginning of the Second World War, 80 years ago, the professional managerial class, or the PMC, accounted for a very small part of the total workforce in capitalist countries like the UK or the USA. The PMC only came into its own after the Second World War. And that, ironically, was because of the working poor, who were pressed into fighting a war that would kill millions of them. And the British politicians had to promise them something in return. The answer was what would popularly be called the Beveridge Report, named after Sir William Beveridge, who compiled it. He proposed that the British state take care of its citizens by providing free education, cheap health care, subsidized housing, unemployment benefits, and old age pension. This was the beginning of the welfare state. So one key reason for the British elite wanting to take care of the working poor was the threat of the Red Menace, the communists, who were becoming increasingly influential in Europe thanks to the example of the Soviet Union. But the British old guard was still not in favor of welfare. Churchill, the wartime Prime Minister and the great hero of Britain's war effort, opposed Beveridge's report when it was tabled in UK's Parliament, saying that the state could not take the burden of so much subsidies. Churchill's stand didn't work out too well for him. The British people booted him out in the 1945 elections right after the war ended. Okay, back to our PMC story, the story of the rise of the middle class as we know it today. Welfarism created a massive need for professionals to manage everything the state was going to do in the post-war era. Bureaucrats and government officials, of course, were needed, but also teachers, doctors, architects, engineers, and many such professionals. And at the same time, the state was entering the economy directly, running factories, railways, airlines, banks, and other financial institutions. These public sector enterprises needed managers too, not paid by private capital, but by the state directly. That is why the professional managerial class, the PMC, exploded in the post-war years. In the UK, for instance, the PMC accounted for about 15% of the workforce in the 1930s, largely because Britain had to maintain a massive empire. By 1951, even though the biggest colony, India, had become independent, the size of the PMC increased to more than 17%. In another 10 years, when the welfare state was well established, it rose to 19%. By 1971, it had gone up to more than 23% of the total workforce, peaking at nearly 25% by 1979. Of course, not all of this employment was in the public sector, since private enterprise was also expanding during this period and it needed its own managers and professionals. But estimates suggest that by the mid-1970s, anywhere between 65 to 70% of all professionals and managers in the UK were employed by the state. This was more or less true for the major economies in continental Europe as well. So the PMC was oriented towards running the state, providing welfare, and also managing public sector companies, which were driven by so-called national interest and not the profit motive. This had a profound impact on how the PMC-led middle class viewed capitalism and capitalists till the mid-1970s. They treated both not just with suspicion but also a degree of disdain. The PMC in much of Europe believed that money making through commerce, what capitalists did, was a crass pursuit. By the way, this is exactly how India's middle class was till the 1980s, the mid-1980s, because our so-called socialism was based on the same welfare model of state-driven capitalism as it was in the UK. But the USA wasn't very different either, by the way, during this period. Even though the state never directly entered the economy, it had a massive role in controlling the economy. In fact, in the US, heavy government spending began even before the war, right after the Great Depression, when millions of Americans lost their jobs and had to depend on free soup kitchens just to survive. Even in the US, the PMC expanded dramatically, from just 10 to 12% of the workforce in the 1920s to more than 17% in 1950, rising further to almost 20% in 1960, 23% in 1970 to a massive 28.5% in 1980. Despite a much bigger role of the private sector in the USA, the government, federal and states, accounted for 45 to 50% of PMC employment till the early 1970s. Two things radically upturned everything from the late 1960s. The first was massive inflation, and the second was growing unemployment. Public opinion began to change significantly on the virtues of welfare and government spending. Intellectuals, especially economists, began to say that the economy needed to be opened up. The animal spirits of entrepreneurship had to be unleashed. The government had to get out of the economy and regulation had to be reduced. This was the great neoliberal turn, And although it would take another decade to take firm root, its impact was already being felt, especially in the USA. From the mid-1970s, the state began to withdraw from playing a major role in the life of its citizens. The process accelerated when Margaret Thatcher came to power in the UK in 1979 and Ronald Reagan became the President of the United States the very next year. The key aspects of the Thatcher-Reagan revolution were privatizing public assets and resources, including utilities like electricity and water supply, and also public services like education, health, and public transport. Deregulating private enterprise, especially banks and financial institutions, which then led to the rise of finance capital across the world and the financialization of all assets. Along with that, neoliberal governments cut back on welfare, put restrictions on labor unions, and made it much easier to hire and fire workers. And finally, they globalized their economies to allow companies to outsource their operations to countries where labor was cheaper. Did this reduce the need for the professional managerial class? Quite to the contrary, it actually increased. Private sector entrepreneurs were suddenly doing what the state had done for 3 decades. The capitalist class needed an entire army of managers and professionals to manage their massively increased role, not just in the economy, but overall in the society itself. This was the beginning of the managerial revolution. The PMC now moved into corporate offices with a sole purpose, maximizing profit for their employees. Managers and professionals now got paid much more than what the government used to pay them. And this was especially true if you made it to the top level of the corporate ladder, into the so-called C-suite of CEO, CFO, CMO, and so on. The biggest gainers were those who worked in finance, the investment bankers, fund managers, and the stockbrokers. I'm tempted here to put in a few clips from movies like Wall Street or The Big Short to make this a little bit more interesting, but can't afford a copyright strike, can I? Anyway, the point is that the professional managerial class, the PMC, which formed the core of the middle class, increasingly began to consider itself to be partners of the entrepreneurs, of the capitalist class. Their growing affluence meant that they spent a lot of their money on discretionary spending, like decorating their homes, buying high-end gadgets and cars, spending a lot on entertainment and leisure, like eating out in restaurants or going on fancy foreign holidays. And when they spent, they enriched the lower middle classes as well, like salespeople in shops, customer relations staff, restaurant workers, beauticians, nurses, and various other types of lower-end white-collar workers who didn't count in the PMC proper. The peak of this PMC revolution came in the early 2000s. Gallup's polls show that in 2000, 63% of Americans self-identified as middle class. This would have been broadly true for the rest of the developed world as well, and also developing countries like India, where economic reforms had unleashed a new middle class. In our case, the IT outsourcing revolution led to a massive increase in the size of the PMC, as millions of families from the hinterland entered the middle class. It is common to hear experts say that India has a 200 million strong middle class. That is why the 2000s is the period when glitzy malls with their fashion brands burgeoned across India, and people became increasingly interested in what was called lifestyle content on TV, food, fashion, and fun. This would continue till early 2008 when suddenly everything changed. The markets across the world crashed as big banks collapsed under the weight of risky home loans that had been given to the poor. As the world came under the grip of a recession, the bottom of the PMC fell off and the middle class shrunk sharply. As I said earlier, in 2000, 63% of Americans considered themselves to be middle class. By 2008, that fell to 56% and then collapsed further to 50% by 2012. The collapse of the PMC was delayed in India, mostly because of big salary hikes that the Manmohan Singh government gave to government employees in 2009. But from 2011-12, pay hikes began to slow down and job opportunities shrank. The worst hit since then has been the IT sector, where salaries have remained flat for nearly a decade now, and real income, adjusted for inflation, has actually fallen sharply. The PMC across the world never really recovered from the impact of the global financial crisis of 2008-9. Our living standards have barely improved in the past decade. In most cases, it has actually become worse. In the early 2000s, the PMC invested in a home of their own within a few years of starting on a new job. They were confident that they would be able to pay off the home loans they were taking. This has completely changed in the past few years. The average middle class family can no longer afford to buy a home in any of India's metros. If you're interested, I've done a deep dive into this issue. Do watch my video on it. I will leave a link in the description. But it is not just about India. The old PMC is not able to buy homes anywhere, whether it is the USA or UK, because they don't earn that much anymore. And now there is AI. It is threatening to wipe out middle management from across the corporate world. I have a detailed video on this. Again, I will leave a link in the description. Do watch it after this video. From the 1980s to the mid-2000s, we the middle class gained from the end of welfare, the weakening of labor, the sharp rise in profit rates, and the resulting concentration of private wealth. We enabled the richest, the owners of capital, to extract even more from workers, helping capitalists maximize their profits. We became their voice in the public space, providing them with the ideological justifications for privately taking over and accumulating public assets. We were the biggest supporters of growing inequality that began in the 1980s and continues till today. Look at this graph showing how the share of national income in the US changed between 1940 to 2023. First, the share of the richest 1%, the blue line, dropped sharply, while that of the bottom 50%, the red line, rose gradually. And then the process got reversed from the 1980s, with the richest 1% actually crossing the bottom 50% in the mid-2000s and increasing the gap since then. The exact same thing is true for India. This graph shows the relative share of national income of the richest 1%. Again, blue line, and the poorest 50%, the red line, beginning from 1951 till 2023. Again, you can see inequality reduced till the 1980s and then increased sharply. Like in the USA, the share of the richest 1% crossed that of the bottom 50% sometime in the mid-2000s, and that gap has continued to widen. Both these graphs are estimates made by the Paris-based World Inequality Labs. You could say that they are not entirely accurate, but there's no evading the fact that inequality has increased dramatically in the past 30 years and that we, the PMC, gained from it. In fact, the PMC, which led the middle class for the past 75 years, gained in both periods. The post-war phase of welfare capitalism and the post-80s phase of neoliberalism. First, we gained by controlling the state and dominating civil society, and later by getting a decent share of the increasing profits that the capitalists made. But now, inequality has caused a massive contraction of consumption in most parts of the world. Since a majority of people don't have money to buy goods and services, the owners of capital have no interest in expanding their businesses anymore. So what are they doing? They have stopped investing in the productive process. They are buying back shares and returning their cash to equity investors and also giving large dividends to them. And they are increasing their profit margins by sharply cutting costs. As long as only the blue-collar workers were being affected by the cost cutting, we the middle class didn't really care. But now it is our turn. AI has made it possible for our employers to get rid of us. And they've also realized that they save much more by sacking one PMC employee than they would if they laid off 6 blue-collar workers. This is an existential crisis for the PMC and therefore the entire middle class. We were the biggest beneficiaries of the neoliberal revolution when it began in the mid-1980s and spread through the 1990s and early 2000s. That neoliberal revolution has come to its logical end now. The search for profit maximization is ensuring that capitalists are getting rid of the expensive PMC employees first. The PMC middle class, which helped usher in this revolution, is now going to pay the price for it. As always, I know what I say goes against the grain of mainstream wisdom, so I'm sure a large number of you watching this won't agree with me. So get into the comment section right now and let me know what you think and criticize what I have to say. That's the entire objective of my videos, to raise a debate, to bring about a discussion where we all benefit from our collective wisdom. And don't just listen to the same hackneyed opinions of the so-called experts. We need to question everything in these uncertain times. So until next time, de omnibus dubitandum, doubt everything.